Please, the court. Counsel. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, at the outset of this case, Mr. Blair stood in front of you and told you this is a tragedy, not a crime. And that's exactly what the evidence shows. When we talk about a tragedy and not a crime, it's important to know the difference. As Ms. Timmons pointed out, the evidence shows this is an emotional situation. This trial has not been easy for any one of us. When something happens like this, when a child dies, it is normal for us to react emotionally. I suggest to you that to react any way other than emotionally makes us something less than human. But that emotional reaction that we have to a situation like this is not justice. It's vengeance. It's our desire to explain to ourselves how something this terrible can happen, and the natural human desire to hold someone accountable for that. And that's the difference between a tragedy and a crime. Your duty here is not to seek vengeance. Unfortunately, it's not to have an emotional reaction. Your only duty is to do justice. I'm going to talk with you about justice. Briefly, though, I want to let you know that I think this is a beautiful courtroom, and I bring that up not to flatter you, but there's a reason. Because as I mentioned to you, I normally practice in Dubuque. And one of the things that I love about practicing law in Dubuque is that over the judge's desk, we have a wooden carving. It's in Latin. And that carving says Fiat Justitia. I don't know if you're familiar with Latin. I'm not terribly familiar with it. But what that means is let justice rule. And that's half of a very important saying. The full saying is actually Fiat Justitia Ruat Caelum, which means let justice rule even if the heavens fall. That's how important it is to do justice. Your job here is to look at the facts. Look at all the facts in this case. And then to apply the law to those facts. When you do that, it becomes clear Mr. Koehn is not guilty. Let's start with one of the most important facts. A fact that has never, ever been disputed in this case. Cheyenne Harris is the primary caretaker for Sterling. That is absolutely undisputed. This is important because she was at home with Sterling. She knew when Sterling was fed or not fed. She knew when Sterling was changed or not changed. I want to be 100% clear about this when I talk about Ms. Harris. I am not up here to villainize her. Villainize her, I believe, would be to villainize depression. Far too much of that in our society. This her depression makes this a tragedy. When we talk about blaming people, I think that comes from the natural desire to seek vengeance and not justice. The evidence in this case is absolutely undisputed that she stayed at home with Nala and with Sterling. Her testimony, the way that Mr. Koehn was raised, is that a woman took the child rearing role and a man took the breadwinner role. It may not be the role in your household. It's not necessarily the role in my household. Even without that evidence, it is still clear that Ms. Harris did not work outside of the home. Mr. Koehn did work outside of the home. She stayed home. She took care of the children. Now, the state talked a lot about the fact that Mr. Koehn did not change diapers. And I think that it's important to talk about that. This had been their relationship from the beginning, from now. This was not a conscious act or a conscious decision, where when Sterling was born, Mr. Koehn said, I don't do diapers. As Nala was an infant, he relied upon Ms. Harris to change diapers. This is something that we were both aware of. This was not a situation that is unique to Sterling. Even without that, it would make sense for him to trust her to do this. Why would you not trust the person who is at home and is taking care of your daughter to also take care of your son? Now, the state has talked with you about the smell. Mr. Koehn sat in front of you under oath, explained to you that he smelled, that the room smelled, and that he talked with Ms. Harrison, and that he took a bag full of dirty diapers out there and thought that that was a lingering smell. As has been pointed out, you do not leave your common sense at the courtroom door. Those of us who have raised children know about the smell of diapers, know that the smell can linger. These facts show Mr. Koehn is not guilty. Another very important fact comes to us from Mr. Koehn's interview with Agent Turbot. I'm going to bring this up. That interview happened hours after he called 911. His interview with Agent Turbot was not a situation where he had heard all of the state's evidence, heard from their experts, and was able to tailor what he told Agent Turbot. This happened hours after he called 911. He told Agent Turbot that he trusted her to feed Sterling because that was her thing. He said that he worked nights, but it is very important to remember that Mr. Koehn did in fact feed Sterling while working 70 to 80 hours a week, longer hours than he was actually getting paid for, with double loads, staying in his truck doing paperwork. He was feeding Sterling. While he was on the road, I want to point out as well that we know, not just from Mr. Koehn's testimony, from the testimony of Jordan Clark and the testimony of David Nugent, Mr. Koehn was far from exhibiting an extreme indifference for the life of his son, far from acting with malice aforethought, far from doing acts of cruelty as the state alleges, was on the road trying to get things for Sterling. Contrary to the state's assertion that he took better care of his dog than he took of his family, we know that to not be true. No one was telling Mr. Koehn, hey, I'm feeding the dog, I'm taking care of the dog, as was going on with regard to Sterling. If you look at State's Exhibit 29, which the state has shown you, you know there was formula in the house. You'll recall Deputy Russell's testimony. I believe he said, but you'll recall for yourselves when he said that the blue can was about 3/4 of the way full, the other can behind it, which said sensitive on it, was about 1/4 of the way full. Mr. Koehn was providing for his family. He was not willfully neglecting the needs of Sterling. He did, as he testified, and as we've heard about, observed that Sterling was underweight. He told that to Sheriff Heumann. You saw him say that on the body camera video. You heard him tell that to Agent Turbot. Sterling was growing, but not growing around. And Brandy Harris told us that she had observed that he was stretching out. That's what she told Agent Turbot when she talked to as well. Not to the extent, however, that Brandy Harris, a grandmother who cares for Sterling, was concerned enough about it to do anything about it. I want to be clear, I'm not saying that was a failing on her part. She's simply saying, noticing that Sterling was underweight, did not give concern when she observed that. The state wants you to hold Mr. Koehn accountable for noticing the same thing. As I said, Mr. Koehn fed Sterling. And the timing here is crucial. When Agent Turbot said, when did you last do it? He said, about 2 weeks ago. If Mr. Koehn thought or knew or had any inclination that Sterling was dying from malnutrition and dehydration, why would you tell a law enforcement officer, it's been about 2 weeks since I fed him? That indicates to you that Mr. Koehn did not know what was happening with Sterling. Why not say, a couple of days, we take turns, I can't remember. Instead he says it was about 2 weeks ago. That timing is exceptionally important because we know through the testimony of Dr. Huntington that the insects form over a period of, it was estimated, of about 10 to 14 days. Recall Dr. Huntington's testimony about the 4-month-old child whose stool he tested. That child did not have sepsis. The temperature may have been off. He talked about an 85-degree room. I believe the testimony from Agent Teal was 81 degrees. The timing may have been off, but I'm not here to nitpick about that. Even if you accept the state's time frame, it had been about how long since Sterling had been changed? About 2 weeks. This is very important. If, as the state suggests to you, Mr. Koehn was aware of what was going on for as long as it was going on, why would he tell a law enforcement officer that it's been about 2 weeks since I fed the child? In fact, I'm going to suggest to you that this shows not that Mr. Koehn committed a crime, but that prior to that 2-week period when he was assisting with the feeding, that his feeding is very likely one of the things, his attention to Sterling was very likely one of the things that actually kept Sterling alive. This is not the acts of someone who is acting with an extreme indifference to human life. These are the acts of someone who relied upon a child and infant's primary caregiver to provide these things. Now contrast what Mr. Koehn told Agent Turbot with what Cheyenne Harris said when she was interviewed by the DCI. She said that she had fed and diapered Sterling the day before. We know that is not true. We know that from the testimony of Dr. Klein. We know that from the testimony of Dr. Huntington. If she was going to hide when she last fed and diapered their infant son in the Department of Criminal Investigation, it's likely that she would hide that from Mr. Koehn as well. We do know there were some attempts, at least, to feed Sterling in the last hours of his life, because Deputy Russell testified about the bottle that he found in that room. The bottle that was not empty. The bottle that had not yet turned. What this evidence shows is that when Ms. Harris went in there to feed Sterling, she didn't follow through, that she lost interest. Consistent with the depression that we heard Dr. O'Hara testify about. And again, this shows Mr. Koehn is not guilty. The evidence that we have seen throughout this case backs up what he told you under oath. Recall that he talked quite a bit within hours of calling 911. At that time, he did not know that the entomological evidence was going to show an estimated time period of 10 to 14 days. It would be a couple of weeks back. He did not know what the complete investigation was going to show. At no time was Mr. Koehn able to tailor the statements that he made to Sheriff Heeman, to Deputy Palo, or to Investigator Turbot based on the evidence. These are statements that he's making within hours of calling 911. Let's talk about the 911 call. Timmons talked with you about the fact that Mr. Koehn said the son. Use your common sense. We've all heard people refer to family members as the wife, the son, the daughter, the husband, using what's called a definite article instead of the possessive mind. It does not necessarily indicate detachment. It is a normal pattern of speech for people to use. The state is trying to stretch so far to try and show this, get a conviction that they're reaching even to that pattern of speech. On the 911 call, he says she fed him at 9. Now, he wasn't present for the feeding at 9. Where did he get this information from? Must have gotten that from Ms. Harrison, that Sterling had supposedly been fed at 9. How do we know that Mr. Koehn was not present at this supposed feeding? Because on the 911 call, he says, quote, "She just woke me up." The mail carrier arrived in a shadow. Quote, "She woke me. I was sleeping. I truck at night." We talked with Sheriff Heenan in the bedroom. See this on the body cam video. "I got the phone and called y'all right away." Now, in his interview, he talked about 11:30 or 11:40, but you heard him testify about the fact that his phone was on Mountain Time, an hour behind Central Time in Iowa, which means that it was about 12:30 or 12:40 p.m., approximately, when he was awakened by a crying Cheyenne Harris saying he's gone. Goes outside with her cell phone, tries to call 911. Yes, he smokes a cigarette. He's out there trying to find a signal. At this point, he is aware Sterling has passed away. Cross-examination, he was asked about, why didn't you grab your son to your chest? Why didn't you run from door to door screaming for help? I have no idea how I would cope with the death of one of my children. And I hope that none of us ever have to find out how we react to that situation. But I also hope that based on our reaction and our coping mechanisms, that no one tries to argue that I am guilty of a crime. There's no prescribed way to react to finding out that your infant is dead. You saw for yourself his demeanor on cross-examination. You remained calm, even while asked very difficult questions. He held his emotions in, not showing them in public. It's very common for men not to show their emotions. Do not judge you. Based on his coping skills. That is not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. But you don't have to guess at what his demeanor was like that day. We know what it was like. He was on Sheriff Heenan's body camera. You watched him yourself. Sheriff Heenan accurately described his demeanor as somber. Somber means sad, serious. He answered questions. He was quiet, but it was clearly he was somber. Both Agent Turbot and Deputy Paler testified that he had a flat affect, or that he spoke with a flat affect, consistent with someone who was being depressed, or perhaps not in the medical definition of shock, but had certainly received a strong psychological shock. Again, people cope with trauma in different ways. Mr. Koehn was home on the weekend. He told you about the fact that Ms. Harris was bringing Sterling out of the room, but that he still had the blankets on him. It shows Dr. Huntington's testimony was that if those blankets were left in the place that they were, and were brought out exactly like Mr. Koehn said that she was, those eggs would not have been disturbed. Those eggs still, but the evidence does not support what the state is arguing for. Mr. Koehn talked with us about the light in the bedroom, and the state is faulting him for not recognizing Sterling in the bedroom and the loss of weight on the other sides. First off, we have to recall that Mr. Koehn is getting home very early in the morning. It's likely dark. We also heard from Mr. Koehn talk about the lamp that was that's in the closet, about the concerns about the overhead light hurting Sterling's eyes. We know that in that bedroom, as the state has told you, there was a quilt hanging over the window, which would have kept the room dark. The state has talked about this quilt and the heat in the room, and I would remind you that the thermometer readings place it about 5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer in that room than in the rest of the house. I believe the testimony was 76 degrees in the rest of the house and about 81 degrees in that room. We all live in Iowa. We've all been through an Iowa August. August in Iowa is not necessarily the time you want a lot of air coming in through your window because it's warm and it's humid outside. That blanket also kept it dark in there. Another thing that we know that Mr. Koehn said is he thought that it was SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Is that unreasonable? Tony Friedrich was thinking SIDS, or she was thinking it was something respiratory. Again, these are statements that Mr. Koehn is making immediately. He makes a statement like this on the 911 call. He makes a statement like this when someone calls him when he's talking with Agent Turbett. He makes the statement to Agent Turbett. But more importantly than making these statements, in the intervening time, between when he calls 911 and when he is arrested, he doesn't run away. Ms. Harris wants to run away. He wants to stay here and find out. These are actions that are consistent with somebody who does not understand why their child died, and a grieving father who wants answers. He's distraught, and he's confused. This is not someone who has a disregard for human life, or who had formed at any time malice aforethought regarding Sterling. Sterling, a child that he not only fathered, but that he literally brought into this world with his own hands. This is a child that Mr. Koehn delivered himself. The state has come before you with some sort of flimsy evidence about, well, there were some comments with his brother about how he maybe didn't think that this child was his. And that supposedly leads to some sort of malice against this child. And there is absolutely no evidence of that whatsoever. I remind you, Mr. Koehn was raised in a household where he is not biologically related to his father, he's not biologically related to his mother, he's not biologically related to any of his siblings. And you will also recall that when Mr. Koehn and his brother were talking about this, that Zach's response was, even if he's not my son, I'm the one that knows his father as a father. This is a child that when the child was born after he delivered it, he called Randy Harris to say Sterling was born. He called his brother, he called his father. Sterling passed away. He was the one who notified his family. These are all actions consistent with a father who loved his son, who trusted the son's mother, and who was distraught at the death of his son. Even the fact that Sterling slept in that swing shows that Mr. Koehn was not intending to neglect or hurt him. Sterling was born with respiratory issues. Randy Harris suggested sleeping up. Tony Frederick has heard medical professionals make this recommendation to children with respiratory issues. They were following Randy's suggestion to help Sterling. The state has not shown or proved guilt in this case beyond a reasonable doubt. In fact, they're stretching so far to try and get you there to argue that turning on a light or laying down in the bedroom is an intentional act leading to murder. Use your common sense. Those are not intentional acts leading to Sterling's death. Now, I want to remind you that as the court has instructed you, Mr. Koehn, there's no burden of proof in this case whatsoever. We don't have to prove anything. I believe the evidence in this case does show what happened. It's natural for us to say, how did this happen? Well, early on we know that the parents were meeting Sterling's needs. sleeping sitting up because of respiratory needs. They were feeding him, providing diaper ointment for a rash, changing wipes, meaning that when the sensitive skin had a problem, they changed the wipes to address that problem, changing diapers, both changing dirty diapers, changing the type of diapers to address any skin issues, providing organized diaper bags to a babysitter, using sensitive stomach formula to prevent diarrhea, to stop the diaper rash, trading for and spending money on proper supplies. Something happens in the month of August, where there's a steep decline in the care of Sterling. What is that? Well, Mr. Koehn testified that he stopped using methamphetamine. He told you why he used methamphetamine. He used it instead of no dose to keep himself awake. During that period of time, he began to sleep more. It was at this time, tragically, that Cheyenne's depression begins to take over. She's young. She was young when she gave birth to Nala. She was young when she gave birth to Sterling. Instead of one child to care for, she has two. She's abusing substances. She's using methamphetamine. She has relationship troubles, both with her mother, with Mr. Koehn. They're moving around a lot. Remember that Sterling was born in a friend's house. They did not yet have the apartment. Dr. Kammerer talks about baby blues, financial stress. You can go down an entire list of things that Dr. O'Hara told us are risk factors for depression, postpartum period, what we call postpartum depression. She was described as being disconnected, not having any joy by Jennifer Schreiber. Two people, Jennifer Schreiber and Isabel Snyder, observed this young mother outside without Sterling for 20 to 30 minutes. The type of behavior that someone who's experiencing severe depression is going through. Depression caused her not to care for Sterling. And I again want to be clear. I am not trying to villainize Ms. Harris. Depression is a very serious issue. But she was misleading Mr. Koehn about the care that she was providing. As I told you in the 911 call, he said, well, she had fed him that morning, but she'd just gotten up. She told Agent Calloway that she had fed and diapered him recently. She never told Mr. Koehn that she was depressed. She didn't communicate that to him. If she had, he told us that he would have stepped in and provided care. And how do we know that Mr. Koehn actually would have provided care and stepped in? Because in Mr. Koehn's past, when he has proper information, he understands when he cannot care for a child. Remember his son, Katie. But he was aware of the fact that he and his wife could not care for Katie. He asked his family to step in. But he knew that. He had information. In this case, he did not have information. The state has asked Mr. Koehn when he was on the stand about, well, you're not suggesting that with an 8th grade education you can't care for a child. No, that is not what we're suggesting. What we are pointing out is that with limited formal education, with the lack of communication from Ms. Harris, he did not see the warning signs. I think it's important to bring up that there were people involved in this case who could have seen the warning signs. We know that when Sterling was born, his umbilical cord tested positive for methamphetamine. Had that hospital done its job as required by law and reported that to the Department of Human Services, services could have been provided to this family. Mental health services, financial services, child care services could have stepped in. If you want to fault someone for not understanding what was going on, someone who should have known better, it's the hospital. They're not on trial here, but I do point out to you that there were services available. You cannot hold Mr. Koehn to that same level of culpability. We know that Ms. Harris was the primary caregiver. We know that she was not feeding. We know that she was not changing Sterling. We know that she was aware of the smell because she's the one who placed those wax air fresheners underneath his seat. She did anything that she could do to try to hide her depression, especially her depression from Mr. Koehn. She let it hit her lack of care. It's so obvious it goes without saying that nothing about this case is easy. I want to remind you again, it's your job is to do justice. Natural to have that emotional reaction, to seek vengeance, to want to blame somebody, but that's not your job to seek vengeance. Nothing that anyone does in this courtroom will bring Sterling back. And no one in this courtroom regrets that more than Zach Koehn. Now, as the judge told you, the state has the burden of proof. I had the opportunity to get up here and speak with you again. This is my last opportunity to speak with you. I'm asking you to do your jobs in this case. Do justice by returning the verdict as required by law and as demanded by justice. Not guilty, count one. Not guilty, count two. Thank you.